Okay. I'm happy to introduce Arnold Coombs. He has been he's the seventh generation maple farmer, and he is currently the general manager of the Brown family farm. And he is also general manager of the two other companies that are subsidiary companies to that. Currently, Arnold serves as the chairman of the Vermont Industry Council, and he's a former member and past director of the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association. I'm proud to introduce Arnold Coombs.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for having me. And I was going to talk about how the changes of the maple industry have happened in the last few decades and where we are today as an industry. I'm going to do a bit of a screen share here if I can. If I can. Come on. Can you all see that?
No, we can't.
Like, you don't see a PowerPoint page?
No.
Okay, I am sorry. Maybe the screen share is not quite there. Well, how about that?
It's coming up now. There it is.
Okay, good. So, there we are. The maple industry has grown a lot over the last, especially 20 years, but both on the production side and the marketing side, there's been a tremendous amount of change. And here at Bascom Maple Farm, that's the actual company I work for, out of Alstead, we handle about 10% of all the world's maple. So 1 out of every 10 drops somewhere going in the world comes from us. We buy from about 3,500 farmers, mostly in the US, some in Quebec. We have a warehouse in Quebec, which actually has mostly Maine syrup in it. So we buy a lot of syrup from northern Maine, and to get it home, we have to take it north through Quebec and then get it down here. Our main facility in Alstead has about 200,000 square feet. We employ about 80 people. We have our own sugar making operation. We tap this year right around 110,000 trees. Had an off year, we had about 38,000 gallons. Last year was about 45,000. About 3,500 acres up there in Alstead, most of it contiguous. I joined the Bascom company back in around 2000. I sold my company, Coombs Family Farms, to them, and we have grown considerably since then. So we were probably ranked number 25 or something back then, and we're in the top 3 now. We have the number 1 brand in natural and the number 2 brand nationwide. So we move a lot of maple. We also sell a lot of bulk product to manufacturers. So anything from Stonyfield yogurt to Johnsonville sausage, Boar's Head meats, Thomas English muffins. We have syrup and all of those things. So quite a bit going on. But last year, the industry produced just under 5 million gallons in the US. That was a record year for anyone's memory. That's up from 1988, where we produced about 900,000 gallons. So a lot of growth there. But to give a comparison, the record years for the US were back in 1864 and 1865, when they produced around 6.7 million gallons. So there are a lot of reasons for that. One is there's Civil War going on, couldn't buy sugar. So everyone was making their own. And there's a ready market for it. So that was the peak time. And it was downhill from there until about 88, and then it started taking off. And a lot of it had to do with production methods. And so you look at some of the, you can see how the dip here was down to 88. Then we started growing. This goes up to about 2007. And now it's taken off even more. If you look at production methods, the old with the metal spout and galvanized bucket, now almost everything is tubing. As a matter of fact, we can't even buy syrup from someone who uses a galvanized bucket anymore due to the lead content. So everything's coming out with tubing. There's been a lot of improvements with the tubing. It started around the 50s and 60s when people experimented with plastic tubing. And about every 10 years, we see a fairly sizable jump in technology. And so now we have, like the spout on the right has a little round ball in there. It's a check valve that spout, so sap can't go back up into the tree when the vacuum is turned off. Most everyone's going to use vacuum pumps now. We'll pull 27 to 29 inches of vacuum. And we've gotten more efficient at using the vacuum. This is a standard layout. And you can see the lines over on the left. These are what we call dry lines. So we'll run just vacuum pipe to the near top of the hill. So we have vacuum, consistent vacuum all the way up, say, a mile away from the sugar house or from the tank. This has increased productivity considerably, figuring this type of stuff out. Now we can get, if you go back to galvanized buckets, you're probably going to average about a quart of syrup for every bucket, 10 gallons of sap essentially. With tubing, modern tubing, you're going to get at least 2 quarts. And I know some guys, if they're disappointed if they don't get almost 3 quarts. So the productivity goes up. But a lot of the growth that has happened isn't just more trees, but it's being more efficient in the woods. We get more sap per acre. So that's made a lot easier for the growth. Other technology changes that we've had in the woods, we have sensors out on the tubing now. So you can imagine with our 110,000 trees, I mean, we got about 700 miles of tubing in the woods. And if you have a leak, your productivity is falling fast. And to give you a quick comparison, on a perfect day, you can fill a sap bucket. I mean, if you ever tap a tree, you probably know that it can run over. That's 4 gallons of sap. That's 40% of your crop with that bucket. So if you have a leak in the woods with tubing and it's running on the ground because a squirrel got it or a branch fell on it because of an ice storm or something, your productivity plunges considerably. And so we used to spend a lot of time just walking the woods. You check the vacuum gauge, and if it was low, you started walking to find the leak. Well, now we put sensors at the end of the lines. And so if the vacuum drops below a certain point, we'll get a ping on a cell phone saying, lot 15, section 2A has a leak. And we can send someone out there within minutes. And because of this, again, the productivity is much higher. So all this also shows up on a couple of, actually 3 TV monitors in our sugar house, where it's all mapped out with the lines. And you can see where you're pulling the proper amount of vacuum or not, and where you got to send the crew to go fix it. We have a year-round woods crew of 4. They're always out in the woods, and then we add another 6 to 8 during sugaring just to tap trees and such, and to maintain it. So that's been a lot of improvement there in the woods. That's half the operation. The rule of thumb is you spend your money in the woods, that's where you're going to make your money. And the sugar house is more for show. But the sugar house has changed a lot too. With reverse osmosis machines, more and more farmers have these. The very first one was used in '78 by Bruce Bascom, my boss. My brother had the second one in 1979. We like to say we had the first one to work properly. It was so different, mainly because it just saved on fuel and time. And there's Jones's rule of 86. Jones was a professor up at UVM over 100 years ago. But you take the percent sugar coming out of the tree, the percent sugar of sap, say it's 2%, divide that into 86, and that's how many gallons of sap it's going to take to make a gallon of syrup. So 43. Well, when we had our first RO, we could bring that up to about 6, sometimes up to 8. So you could reduce that down to 10 gallons to make 1 gallon. Well, your fuel usage is down dramatically. Now, most people will bring it up to 18 or 20%. That's where we go. And modern ones like this one, bring it up to 40%. So you can have a huge operation, but a much smaller sugar house, because you're just processing the sap and you're boiling a lot less sap to get the same amount of syrup.
Arnold, can I stop you and ask you how that works? Does that take water out of the sap of the osmosis?
Yes, it does. It's the same process as desalination of salt water. So as we're, say, it's big in the Middle East, where they run salt water through a desalination plant, they get rid of the brine and keep the pure. we essentially take it from the other pipe. We get rid of the pure, keep the concentrated sap. So it's a semi-permeable membrane that under high pressure, 400 or 500 pounds, only the pure water can get all the way through. And so we can get rid of that pure water. We actually use a lot of it for cleaning. And then what you have left is a higher concentrated sap.
Cool.
So it's a huge energy savings, space savings, and time savings. So to give you an example, in 1966, my dad had the largest sugar house in the industry. He was tapping about 26,000 trees, most of those with buckets. And it took 3 very large evaporators, and it would take 4 gallons of oil to make 1 gallon of syrup. Now, I'll show you a video here in a minute of Bruce's evaporator, but we used less than a quart of oil to make a gallon of syrup. So huge savings there. So this is your typical operation. This one was over in Guilford, actually. Wood-fired, 3x9 evaporator. They boil from about 1,200 taps. You know, they'll make 300 or 400 gallons. This is our evaporator. It's a little bit bigger than that, not much, but we use steam. Oh, sorry. And it looks like the video is not going to work here. It's a very interesting. And with this evaporator, that's all that we have for an evaporator for 110,000 trees. But with this, we can pull off about 200 gallons of syrup an hour. And with ROs, you know, you're not boiling all night. I remember when I was a kid, my dad doing all-nighters, just boiling around the clock, because when the sap's there, you got to boil. But now you process it with an RO, you can fit it into a schedule. Just boil from 8 to 6 today, 8 to 2, whatever, however much sap you have. So it's changed a lot. And then it's stored in drums. When I was a kid, we used galvanized drums. The whole industry did. Now everything is stainless steel or plastic, of course, for food grade. This is a shot in one of our coolers. We can store about 13,000 drums in this one cooler. Quite a few million pounds. So that's the production side. And then you start looking at the market. And if you go back to '88, it's one of our worst years in the US. You had about 900,000 gallons of syrup made. It was just a bad year. Much like this year, Mother Nature did not cooperate. And Canada was a little bit more than us. You can see it probably 1.7 million gallons. And then as you just follow along, we grow. And part of that's due to technology, part of it's due to the price being stabilized. Right around 2000, there's a group of farmers in Quebec that got together and approved what's called a federation, a farmers cooperative. And they control milk and a bunch of other things up there. And now they control maple. And so they now can set a floor price that everyone has to go by in Quebec. In Quebec produces about 70% of all maple. So, you know, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the industry. And so with that floor price set, farmers knew that it wasn't going to be wild fluctuations on what they were going to get for their syrup. Before that, they could get, say, $2 a pound on one year. And then if it's a huge abundant crop, it might go down to $1 a pound the next year. And you just couldn't plan. My brother got out of maple because he said, this is back in the late 80s, that, you know, a big crop, he's got a lot of syrup, but he can't make any money because it's so low. And a short crop, the price is great, but he doesn't have enough syrup to make any money. So he's losing every year. It's much more stable now. And the Federation had a lot to do with that. You can see in 2000, there's some decent growth going on there. And then it just kept going. The market grew right along with it, in sync for the most part, until about 05, 06, excuse me, 07, 08, and 09. We had 3 bad years in a row. And so the prices went through the roof because the Federation sets a floor, but not a ceiling. And so the prices went through the roof, and we lost market. You know, stores just said, instead of having 3 SKUs, we're going to have 1. And then we had to buy that all back in the teens. And you can see where the market took off again. But one thing that happened with that stability, in addition to farmers feeling comfortable that they could expand, banks felt comfortable they could loan money to farmers because they knew there was a floor price. Packers, and we're considered a packer. We buy syrup and we pack it. we felt comfortable spending money on marketing. So when a chain says, yeah, we'll take you on for a slotting fee of $30,000 a SKU, and we bought 3 SKUs, we got to write a check for 90 grand. When prices are going all over the place, you're a little hesitant to do that type of thing. But when you're confident that you're going to be there next year and the year after, you can see you're going to get an ROI out of it. Otherwise, you just weren't. And so with that growth in the market, farmers kept expanding, and sugar makers are just like dairy farmers. When the price of milk goes up, everyone gets more cows and they drive the price back down. Same thing happens in syrup, pretty much. When the price is up, more and more trees get tapped. And so you can see we had some nice growth right up through last year. And last year, it was probably a 210 million pound or 20 million gallon market, the biggest we have seen in modern memory. And 90% of that is domestic in the US and Canada, and the other 10% is export. We do some export ourselves. We used to export a fair amount to Europe, but there's tariffs on US syrup, but not on Canadian syrup, 8%. So we are not that competitive anymore there. But we do fairly well in the Middle East, in Asia, Australia, New Zealand. We ship to about 34 countries, 35 countries, somewhere in there. And you're seeing demand in other countries grow. Right now, I think we have shipments on the docks going to Israel, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea. It's just a regular part of business now, which is rather nice. Right, this year in particular, it's an off year. We probably have 70% of a crop throughout the industry. Certain areas did a little bit better than others, and some did worse, but about 70%. So you're going to see an increase in the prices at the store. If you guys need syrup, buy it now. I recommend that. Because within 2 months, it'll be higher for sure. It's just supply and demand. That's what it is. We're seeing at least a 10%, if not 15% increase at the farm level. And that obviously gets passed on. So those are the big changes we've seen in the industry. It's other stuff that has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. We're seeing venture capitalists come in and buy up our competition. That's changing the dynamic a lot. In some cases, that's good, because you'd have wildcat, owners that say, well, I just want to steal this customer, and they go in with a crazy price. You don't get that when they have to have a return for a venture capitalist. So it has smoothed it out a little bit. But then again, they do some other crazy stuff. So it's changed it in that sense. Everyone's adapting to that. But I think 4 of our competitors now owned by venture capitalists. So it's an interesting dynamic. We get calls all the time, but no interest in selling. So in a nutshell, that's what's happened in the maple industry for changes. Anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Other than the Northeast United States and sounds like Quebec, where else is maple syrup, harvested or produced around the world? Not only around the country, but also around the world.
It's pretty much all in the Northeast here. There's something called big leaf maple syrup out in the Northwest, but it has a slightly different flavor. And I've talked to 2 people that said they made it in Siberia when they were younger, and that it does not taste like ours. But there's about at least 115 different species of maple in the world, and 2/3 of those are in Asia. But it's the sugar maple that makes the best, and that's what we've got predominantly in Vermont in particular, but in the Northeast.
Arnold, nice to see you again. Do I understand that you can get greater yield out of smaller trees than you can out of big ones? I think I read that article someplace. Really small ones. I mean, not half size, but really small when they're first growing.
You can get, well, there's different ways of looking at this. We will tap small trees that are, say, 8 inches in diameter, because we know we're going to cut them down in a few years, because we're going to let the other ones next to it grow. So we've got tubing going by it anyways. You might as well tap it because it's going to be firewood in the near future. So you're not that worried about the health of that tree. But generally, we're not tapping anything below 10, 12 inches. Those tend to run really well, but you know, I've got some older trees. There's some my great grandfather tapped in the 1800s that just flow like crazy, and so I'd hate to say that's the way it is, that the younger ones are better, but I can say that sugar makers, when they find a new lot, a new sugar bush that has a lot of young trees that haven't been tapped, everyone gets excited. You know, virgin trees. So they tend to.
Arnold, question. Good to see you again.
Yes.
Some years ago, maybe 5, 8, whatever, the UVM Maple Research Center came up with this new planting regime that they were doing on maples with like apple orchards, small trees.
Yes.
Off the top. Whatever happened to that?
They're still experimenting off and on with that. I think the last I heard, they have planted a number of trees that they're working with. And the best way to do it, you know, they'll cut off a tree that's say 2 inches or 3 inches in diameter, and the tree will sprout branches off to the sides. And what they like to do is have 4 or 5 of those branches grow to be a couple of inches in diameter. And then they would cut off those on alternate years and tap those. So you'd have this stump essentially that's 2 to 4 inches in diameter with these other small branches coming off, and they would tap those branches. That's the last idea that I've heard. And so they're experimenting with that, but they're letting those trees grow to have those branches coming off. And the whole purpose of that is in case something drastic happens to the industry. Emerald ash borer is going through and taking out all the ash. What if something comes through and takes out a lot of the maples? If you have them growing together, you could potentially spray them or control the pest at least.
And the other thing they predicted, this was about 10 years ago, that in 50 years or so, that most of the maple will be in Quebec because of climate change.
It might be longer than that, but the sugar maple is migrating north. Obviously, this climate change has had a big issue with maple production. It's earlier than ever, and it tends to be shorter on average than it was 30, 40 years ago, up to a week shorter on average. So luckily, the new technologies help us with that. If you were all on buckets and you tap too early, those tap holes dry out. But with tubing, you can tap early and the tap hole doesn't dry out. So we can tap trees in January, hoping that, well, if mid-February they start running, great. If in late February, early March they start running, we're still good. Whereas with a bucket, you could never do that. You want to be within a few days of when it's going to start running. So it allows us to be a larger operation. But you are right. Long term, 150 years, I'm not sure how many sugar maples we're going to have here.
Arnold, did the gypsy moth, there was some fear when they attacked the forests here several years back that there would be an impact on the maple hardwood. Any comment on that?
Yes, they're always an issue. They tend to go in cycles. And so normally some location in the state is going to get hit one year, every year. North Vermont had some last year. So it does move around, and it's always there. But it's been there most all of my life, off and on. Some farmers don't tap trees when they've been hit really hard. So they let the tree kind of have a year off and gets all the sap it can. The trees are stressed with other things. Last year we were very dry. And that's some thoughts on why the crop is down this year. So a friend of mine taps 40,000 trees in northern Vermont. He got the same amount of sap he did last year when he had a record year, but he had 72% of a crop because the sugar content was so low. And the theory is that because it was so dry, the tree couldn't generate as much starch to store in the roots last summer as it could normally. And that's why the crop's down.
Arnold, I have a question as a 7th generation maple farmer. What's your favorite grade of maple syrup?
It really depends on what I'm doing, I think, but I tend to like the darker syrups, the dark robust probably. But I was raised on golden, the really light stuff. Back then, my family was buying a few thousand drums from farmers, and we would pick out the top 1 or 2 and stick it in the corner for just family and friends. And it was always just beautiful, clear, but with a nice maple flavor. But the flavors are different now because you got ROs. So you pick it so fast, sometimes you don't have quite the same flavor. And that's, I call it techno syrup. But the reality is, in taste tests, people can't tell the difference. If you blend it right, like we have 19 silos, we can store about 120,000 gallons of syrup in different tanks, different grades, depending on different source, Vermont, graded dark robust. And we will blend syrup from different farmers to get a consistent flavor profile. And that's where the art part comes into it. So you have a good product all the time. If you don't blend it right, then you're up the creek. But if you blend it right, you're in good shape doing that.
Arnold, can I ask you if it seems like online sales of maple has been really increasing a lot, and I've heard that Hidden Springs Maple up in Putney, do they do the same thing as you? And before you answer, I want to just tell you I was in Quebec City a couple years ago with my wife, and I told them that I was from Vermont, where we make all the maple syrup, and they had a nice smile for me and then kindly explained how ignorant I was of how much maple syrup they make in Quebec. But.
Yeah, they do make a lot. So yeah, they're an up and coming company. They are similar to us in many ways, but they do more e-commerce than we do. We're not as interested in the onesies and twosies as we are the truckloads. So we do some of the national brands. We do a lot of private label. But we have a number of tractor trailer loads leaving each day. You can't get that with onesies and twosies. Well, we can. Amazon can maybe, but we can't. And you're right. And Vermont does produce a lot. Of all the U.S. syrup, Vermont produces about 40 to 45% of all U.S. syrup.
Just want to point out, last season at the co-op, and I forget what the label was. It just said last run on it because I'm a family of grade B eaters from way back. It said last run, and so I bought it. It was the most delicious maple syrup I'd ever had. So
really dark and really strong, I suppose.
Really dark, really strong. So like my coffee.
Yes, we sell a lot of that to manufacturers in 55-gallon drums and 1,000-liter totes. We're shipping a ton of that to manufacturers. That's what they want because it's the cheapest and the strongest. Anything else?
Yeah, Arnold, I had a question. I'm seeing, you go into certain stores and they'll say organic maple syrup and like, what's the difference between organic and non-organic maple syrup? And I'm not talking about log cabin, but
there's not a lot of difference, but to be certified organic, you have an inspector come, they go through your forest, they make sure you're not overtapping the trees, that you're thinning the woods properly, in a sustainable manner. And it's all about sustainability. And with our miles of tubing, how do we clean that? Some people might have used a chemical cleaner, and there are certain ones you can use. Are you using it correctly, flushing it, that type of thing? We don't use chemicals, but some people do. And then in the boiling process, are you using a defoamer, which almost every sugar maker will? And if you do, it's got to be an organic defoamer, not just some vegetable oil or lard or anything. So there's no big thing. There's just a lot of little things. We have buffer zones. We have one farmer that plants corn and fertilizes with chemicals. We have a 150-foot buffer zone, so we don't tap trees there. And we became certified organic over in Jacksonville, where I'm from, back in the late 80s. And it was all market demand. I was going up against the big guys, and I had to have something to differentiate. And so we went organic back then, and more than 50% of our sales are organic now.
Well, Arnold, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day. And it's quite an interesting business now. I grew up in Guilford and helped Ken Line, my uncle, when you carry the buckets on your shoulder. And my grandfather boiled, but he just gathered and sold the sap off. But thank you for taking your time. And unless there's any other questions, we'll call our meeting to an end. And have a great day.
Thank you all.